Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Academic Related Professional Services webinar called Keeping the Universities Running, Supporting Academic Related and Professional Services Staff. My name's Jess Meacham. I am the Vice Chair of the Academic Related and Professional Services Committee for UCU, and I'm a Student Experience Manager at the University of Sheffield. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what today's webinar is going to consist of and introduce our speakers. So we're going to be hearing from 3 different people at the start of this session before we move on to taking some of the questions that you submitted in advance. And I just want to say before I begin to introduce everyone, it was so lovely that we had such an amazing response to the call for questions in advance. We had a big long list of questions. We're not going to unfortunately be able to cover them all, but we've tried to pull out some really important ones. And if you want to submit questions live as well, we'll try and pick out any of those that we'll be able to answer towards the end too. So first of all, you'll be able to see Rebecca Spencer on the screen with me. She's our British Sign Language interpreter, and she'll be here throughout the session as well. The other speakers that we'll be hearing from include Alex Lancaster, who is UCU's Health and Safety Official, Jenny Lennox, who is a UCU Bargaining and Negotiations Official, and Amy Ryle, who works with me at the University of Sheffield in a professional services role, and who's going to talk a little bit about organising academic related and professional services members of staff at a branch level. So to kick us off, I'm going to introduce Alex, who's going to give us some advice and guidance about health and safety. Obviously, Alex has been very busy over the last few months in her health and safety role. She joined UCU in April. And yeah, over to you, Alex. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jess. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of some of the guidance that has been put out so far. So we have put guidance out, which is available for you to see on the website, on the employer's duty to consult with health and safety reps and the sort of collective agreements and risk assessments that should be put in place at the beginning of the pandemic. And then we release documents around the types of hazards and controls that exist in HE. So looking at the different sort of occupational roles and the different environments that people work in HE, and the type of control measures that employers should put in place. And of course, with the view that that should be adapted locally to meet the hazards within your institutions. We also put out advice for Black members and disabled members around risk assessment and the equality impact of that to try and support branches in reducing the risks posed to these groups of staff during COVID. And then we also more recently, I think with the return to students in September, we issued guidance that took a 3-pronged approach. So we had collective guidance for branches on how to identify and address the health and safety issues and how to escalate where employers were not putting in place suitable safety measures. And as part of that, we also issued individual letters to branches, which they can facilitate the distribution of to individual members, and also individual members can access the website as well using their membership login. And we have these template letters to protect individual staff who want to work remotely because of their increased risk. And it also breaks down various equality characteristics or additional stresses that may be experienced by people, and any issues that you've identified with the risk assessments, for example. So they're editable letters and they apply in numerous circumstances, including to academic related and professional services staff. And another element of that was the reporting tool. So UCU produced an online reporting tool to report cases of COVID across institutions and also near-miss reporting. So what we mean by that is, so if there's any failed control measures or safety issues within the workplace that have not been addressed and controls not being implemented, then this is an online reporting tool to do that. There's no consistent picture, consistent data coming out from institutions. So this online reporting tool is really quite essential for UCU to see what's actually going on the ground and where the issues are causing the biggest problem really for branches. So in terms of the actions that branches can take to escalate and resolve the health and safety concerns of ARPS members, branches need to ensure that they're being consulted regularly on all these safety measures, including risk assessments. That's the generic COVID risk assessment, as well as specific area, departmental, activity focused risk assessments that may be in place. They need to ensure reps are consulted in good time on the changes taking place, and that the risk assessments continue to protect people from harm. Now, the employer is required to reduce risks to the lowest level practicable, and risks should remain low at all times. And if that's not the case, then we need to be highlighting that and escalating accordingly. So some of the things, as well as a collective approach for your joint safety committees or joint negotiation committees, and regular inspections or investigations in the workplace. You can also utilise accident books for reporting of COVID cases. So the employer is, required to keep accident books, and we can report cases of disease within the accident book and transmission on site, and also near misses, which, we are taking as failed control measures in the workplace. So cleaning hasn't been undertaken, people are consistently not social distancing and or wearing masks, and all those sort of things. And we need this reporting to take place so there's an audit trail if there's any impact on staff. And so we can get these issues investigated and addressed in an effective way at the local level. So there's lots of tools that fall under the health and safety legislation that branches can utilise to try and get some effective actions in place and effective control measures in place within their institution or within the area in which they work. So as part of this, you should, as an individual member or as a rep, you should have a clear local escalation procedure in place so that if there's a hazard that arises, if you're unhappy with the risk assessment, you know how to escalate that health and safety issue. And indeed, that is a requirement placed on staff under the health and safety legislation to make employers aware of any hazards that come to their attention. And so if there's failed cleaning or no social distancing, or if the infection rate is high, if there's been cases of transmission, then you need to be saying, I don't feel like these measures are safe and these need to be addressed. There is also guidance that we put out around serious and imminent danger procedures. So ideally, under some of the regulations, under Regulation 8 in the management regs, we would expect a serious and imminent danger procedure to be put in place. Now, that would obviously protect staff from serious and imminent danger, and it should be clear on what the law expects of the employer and what you can do as a member of staff to remove yourself from imminent harm. Obviously, some of this crosses over with Section 44 of the Employment Rights Act, but this is stronger in the sense that it's a collective agreement that protects staff when they do feel they need to remove themselves from a position of harm in the workplace. So the issues that we're currently facing are, of course, national lockdown, significant student outbreaks, predominantly in halls of residence. There's increased potential of COVID-19 transmission on site across different staff and student groups. And employers do have a moral and a legal duty to protect staff and students from harm and take preventative and protective measures. As the local infection rates increase, we would expect stronger protections to be in place in the workplace. And remember, the institutions are expected to take a precautionary and preventative approach, so we shouldn't be waiting for infections to occur or incidents to happen before employers are taking appropriate measures. So in the face-to-face provision in places like libraries, museums, galleries, student support, IT, our staff are, increasingly experiencing issues around workload and stress. Now, first of all, stress is a workplace hazard. It falls under health and safety legislation. The employer must seek to prevent and control stress within the workplace to low levels. So one way they can do this is through a generic institutional stress risk assessment to identify and control potential stresses in the workplace. So some stresses that we're aware of include increasing workloads, lack of flexibility in your hours, job security, There's increasing requests for ARPS staff to be on site when they can work remotely effectively. There's increasing requests to undertake new duties, and there's a lack of suitable equipment for online and remote working. And as part of that, there is also a lack of breaks and a lack of variety in workloads. Another concern we have is the ability of staff to raise their health and safety concerns for fears of bullying, redundancy, career progression, and detriment in the workplace. And all of these issues are health and safety issues, and some will directly increase people's risk of contracting COVID, and other will increase other risks such as stress and burnout and the short and long-term impact upon mental health. So initially, employers were doing what they could to accommodate, different working arrangements due to the national emergency that COVID presented. But now employers need to put in place sufficient measures to keep staff safe, be that working from home or on site. And so I'll come back to some of the questions that would come through later to get a bit more detail on some of this stuff, but that's it from me.
Thanks very much, Alex. So that was a really comprehensive overview of some of the advice and guidance that that UCU has put out over the last, gosh, how many months is it now? 7 or 8 months. If you haven't seen any of the things that Alex just referred to, or if you want to check out the template letters, for example, then you can have a look on the website. If you go to www.ucu.org/COVID-19, there's a huge amount of advice and guidance related to COVID on the web pages there. And speaking as someone who is active at a branch level, I know that those template letters in particular have been really useful for individuals who haven't been sure how to approach their line manager in talking about wanting to seek remote working where they've been asked to come back in face-to-face as well. So if you're aware of people who are in that situation, the template letters are really, really useful. And of course, the reporting tools as well. If you have been keeping an eye on the sort of national picture, you'll be aware that universities are reporting this data in all sorts of wild and inconsistent and frankly, just baffling array of ways. So UCU's attempts to collect that all centrally are really, really useful. So thanks very much to Alex for that. Our next speaker then is Jenny, who is our bargaining and negotiations official who supports the ARPS committee and the work that UCU does for ARPS members. And Jenny's going to talk a little bit about organising ARPS staff in HE. Thank you, Jenny.
Yes, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about how do we organise ARPS members. And I want to particularly talk about focusing on issues that matter to those members of staff. When we talk about union organising, we often use the phrase something that's strongly felt, widely felt and deeply felt. And I think right now it's probably quite easy to identify issues that fit into that category. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be talking to members and finding out what those concerns are. So I think there's kind of several approaches to do this. The first is to actually look at the issue of organising ARPS-specific meetings, so meetings for academic-related professional services staff. They don't have to be something that fits into the way that you would normally organise your branch, but they can be a really good way of engaging with people. So, setting up a Zoom call or Teams or whatever your equivalent is that you're using in your institution, and making sure you're actually hearing from members on the ground about what their key concerns are. The other thing to do is to look at surveying your academic related members. You could, of course, open that up to non-members as well, trying to, again, get to the heart of what their key issues are. And we'll help you centrally to put something together with that. We've got some stress surveys, workload surveys, but we can do something more general and we can host it for you if that would help. Obviously, you're using that to try and gather information about what the kind of key concerns are by ARPS staff. And we know from kind of the plethora of different questions you've had today that that's a variety of different issues. And what the other thing that this can do is help you to find contacts in each of your different areas that that cover your academic related areas. And I think it's particularly important to make sure you do have contacts in all those different areas so that you've got a better understanding of what's really going on the ground. Obviously, ARPS contacts can help to flag kind of issues in their area. They can report on issues around local risk assessments and problems with them and activity that's happening around that. And also let staff know, let us know if staff are being asked to do completely different tasks from their normal everyday job, or if they're being asked to travel into work when it's completely unnecessary. Because I think it's really important that that dialogue's going on and that these issues are being escalated. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I know that we had questions about a key worker status and whether academic related staff are covered by that. The government guidance is a bit vague. It uses the term specialist education professionals who must remain active during the COVID-19 response. So I think very potentially academic related staff are covered by that, but it is countered by the whether or not there's a need for you to work at your institution or whether or not you can work remotely. And that should be the thing that outweighs everything else. And right now, key worker status doesn't really give you access to anything more than anybody else because, for example, childcare, schools, etc., are running for everybody. But it is worth bearing in mind that you could be covered by that status, but the overwhelming requirement of the institution is to let you work at home where that's possible. But using kind of ARPS contacts that you gather, you can actually feed up more information to the branch. And I think there's quite a few branches that have a specific academic related professional services staff rep on their committee. And Amy, who's going to talk later, is one of them. But there's no requirement in rule to have that. I think it's really important now for academic related staff to make sure they get representation on committees and that they are able to make sure that the kind of issues you're raising are being highlighted and escalated. And that, obviously, Alex has talked about the escalation procedure, but making sure there's proper light being shone on what's happening in individual areas. Because usually, the experience is that something that's agreed at a senior level is then implemented differently locally. And right now, we can't have that. We have to have a situation where everything is happening in the way that it's been agreed. So escalation is really important. I talked a little bit about having a branch ARPS rep, and I think the reason to do that is not just about escalation and kind of raising issues. It's also about making sure that your presence is felt and the activities are felt by academic related members. So they hear what's happening, there's direct communication with them. Even if you do an email out to all members, maybe a specific one to academic related members that would look at the kind of issues you've taken on, the matters you've escalated and where you've won things, because it's important for people to know that you're having successes and that you're doing things on their behalf. I think also something that could be considered right now is low-level actions in certain areas where specific issues are causing concern. So one of the tactics we talk about is something called a majority petition, which is where you seek to get as many people as possible, members and non-members, or members of another union, if you've got Unison or Unite organising in those areas, and getting them to sign up to a petition that asks for agreed set of objectives, aims on a specific issue, and not handing that petition until you reach a certain percentage. It's a majority petition, so anything over 50%, but you can set yourself a target of 60, 70%. And everybody you're trying to get to sign it, you're saying, we won't hand this in until 70% of people support it. But the idea being that you're demonstrating your strength. And it's something you can do virtually. It's not a hard thing, but it's a way of kind of showing that this is, as I said earlier, a strongly felt, widely felt, deeply felt issue. So it's quite a good tactic to use. I think it's really important for UCU's profile among academic related staff to be kind of higher than it has been right now. And so there's lots of things we can do on that score as well. Obviously, majority petitions would help, but just asking people to join a union. I know it sounds really daft, but the single biggest reason for people not joining a union is that nobody ever asked them. And the best means of recruiting staff is like-for-like recruitment. So if you ask your colleagues, you'll recruit more people than if I ask one of your colleagues. Because, it's your union, you own it, and saying to somebody else, be part of it, engage, actually, that's a really good reason for them to get involved. Small things like adding a UCU tag on the end of your emails, putting the joining link in, just saying that you're an active member of UCU, please join us, please get involved. And even we can provide these for you, but like UCU, putting UCU on your background on your Zoom calls or your Teams calls so that people know you're an active UCU member. And again, that UCU is there to help people and support people with the issues they're facing. I think what we want to do is try and create a sense of the collective, stop people seeing themselves as individuals or groups of individuals, and start making themselves seen as part of the academic team who needs to have their voice heard. And what we want to do is build a structure to help improve knowledge of issues that are going on for academic related staff, act upon them and report back. Because if we can empower people to believe that they can act locally and change things, then that's a really good reason to be part of UCU. And that's for me.
Thank you very much, Jenny. That was really useful. I just want to say, if anyone can hear a weird background noise coming from me, my dog 2 floors down is making some relatively quiet noises, but yeah, apologies for that if that's happening. That was a really useful overview from Jenny of what organising for ARPS members of staff can look like. And certainly I know in our branch we've seen a lot of the things that Jenny's talked about be really useful. One of the things that I like to do is include UCU in my email signature. This is a very easy thing to do. I just have a line right at the bottom that says, do you have any comments or questions about the Sheffield UCU branch? Please get in touch. And then I have a link to join as well. So everyone I send an email to, including students, can see where they can find out more information about UCU, and they know that I'm a contact to talk about the branch if they have questions. So following on nicely from that, we are going to hear from Amy Ryle, who is a ARPS member of staff at the University of Sheffield and who has been the lead organiser in setting up and developing a network of PSUCU members at Sheffield. So over to you, Amy.
Hi, thanks Jess, and thanks Jenny for that really helpful overview. So yeah, as Jess says, I work at the University of Sheffield. I'm the impact manager in arts and humanities. And I suppose I've been involved probably in a more hands-on way, probably for about a year. We started professional services staff meetings in November 2019. So it started really around the strikes last year to try and address some concerns that professional services staff had about striking, and also to think about building confidence amongst professional services staff to get involved in picketing in particular. We all know that UCU's often seen and reported in the media, particularly as the lecturers' union, despite having a significant number of professional services members. And all of that, I think, affects recruitment. It means that sometimes professional services members get frustrated at the lack of understanding or addressing of their situations. And also many are quite isolated in their departments or work areas, which all affects engagement with the union. I was one of 2 members last time we were on strike in my faculty role, and we're now up to 5. So I'm really delighted that some of the things that we've been doing have actually had a direct effect in my area. So we have meetings more or less monthly, and obviously from March 2020 we moved them online. I chair them and supported by members of the branch committee and also our branch administrators. So we try and get somebody from branch committee to come, as well as myself, to come to each meeting, just to kind of demonstrate I suppose partly demonstrate the commitment of the branch to its professional services members. And we're getting upwards of about 30 people attending each time. It has been higher on occasion, depending on the topics and the timing, but it's generally about 30 people. And we tend to keep them pretty open. So we open discussion to the floor, with members getting the chance to air any issues they're coming across at work. And we usually also include an update on any branch business to enable professional services staff to talk about things from their point of view. For example, we recently issued a formal grievance to the university over the handling of the COVID crisis. And so we've had a few discussions over that at recent meetings. And they've provided a useful forum, I think, for staff to discuss with other members and for the branch committee to build a picture of what's happening across the university. Obviously, that's particularly useful at the moment when there are a lot of discussions with the university management about working conditions. And what we've also found is that members are very good at offering advice from their own experience. So it's very much a dialogue between professional services members. It's not something that's necessarily led by me. It's really led from the members that turn up to those meetings. What we've done fairly recently is introduce a sort of, I suppose, more like a standing agenda of opportunities to talk about return to campus and to talk about work from home in particular, and then branching it out into other things as the discussion develops. And we've also encouraged people who perhaps are not so keen on speaking on the Zoom call to offer things in advance, so to email me or the UCU at Sheffield's email address with contributions that I can then feed in. So we're trying to make sure that everybody has a chance to contribute, just depending on how they're feeling and what they want to do in those circumstances. We do know that some people don't really like contributing on the day, and so it just gives people a little bit more opportunity to do that. And what we found is that they have proved really useful for initiating member-led action by professional services staff. So a really quite a small example of this, but quite a significant one, is that in one meeting early on in the crisis, we had quite an extensive discussion on university comms and how awful we thought they were. And then what happened was that a member then offered to draft a joint letter to the VC complaining about this, which we then circulated. And as Jenny said, we got signatures, not as many as 70% of the university, but certainly a significant proportion of people who were involved in that. And so we, along with other action, this led to a noticeable change in practice, I think, from the university. And so we were able quite early on in the crisis to indicate that professional services staff are making a difference, and we can do things that are member-led in order to try and help ourselves, I suppose, which is the whole point of the union. And what we've also found is that it's useful for gaining traction with particular campaigns. So as a result of discussions, we're getting new people more involved in the business of the union, agreeing to take part in action groups and things like that. So that kind of relationship I think we're building up with professional services staff is really helpful, because it does mean that people are more willing to get active in the union. And we have definitely seen a rise in professional services membership at Sheffield, and that seems to be happening month on month. So it's not that there was a big spike at the beginning and then that's tailed off. We've actually seen it steadily continue to rise, which is great. I think we've seen professional staff more likely to raise issues outside of meetings. So I suppose because they see me quite regularly, I do get communications from people wanting direct help or support, which I hope means that they're accessing that more readily. And we've also instigated, which was another suggestion at one of our meetings, some joint recruitment, kind of find out more events with other unions. So to try and grow the membership, but to try and give people confidence that when they are talking to colleagues about joining the union, they can signpost them to where to find out more, where to ask questions. And one of the things that has come out quite a lot in our meetings certainly is that slight confusion about whether UCU is an appropriate union for professional services staff. Now, of course, it is in many cases, but there are some instances where maybe a different union would be more appropriate. And so what we've tried to do is to take the approach that although we'd much rather people join UCU, that actually joining any union is a good thing. And we've had some really positive feedback. We did a survey of members after probably about 6 months of meetings, just to see what people were thinking. And people mentioned things like an appreciation of the solidarity that they have been afforded by meeting other members, perhaps not feeling alone in the struggles and helping to combat isolation. We know that professional services staff are often in very small numbers, union members in various parts of our universities, and so helping them to connect with other people across the university has been really helpful. We've done some good work, I think, formulating strategies for professional services staff, for example, in how to take part in action short of a strike. And I think professional services members just feel like a bit more of a coherent group now, with cross-departmental knowledge and more of an ability to support one another. And I think all of this has come out of those meetings. So it's a really straightforward way to gather this information and to build solidarity across the university. They're not very time consuming to organise. I wasn't a member of the branch committee when we started them, although I am now for my sins, but I can guarantee it, if you go to your branch committee, suggest this and offer to get involved, I'm sure they'll be delighted to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was a really useful case study in what ARPS organising can look like in a certain branch. I just want to pick up on one of the things you talked about, which was the increasing membership from professional services members, which is really, really welcome. And just to sort of add in the fact that this year in particular, Sheffield has pursued a really quite aggressive membership strategy, or really proactive would be a better way of phrasing that, perhaps, where we've sort of systematically gone through all the different work areas where we have members, and we've looked at who is a member and who isn't a member, and we've talked to departmental reps and contacts about reaching out to people who aren't yet union members and starting to have those conversations that Jenny was talking about, you know, the peer conversations that are more likely to be successful in persuading people to join the union. So I think it's really important that the ARPS organising and the kind of meetings that Amy's just described sort of take place within a wider branch recruitment strategy as well. Because obviously we all need to be doing all that we can to persuade as many people as possible to get involved with their branch. And the other thing I wanted to say quickly, just before we move on to questions, was about moving to online meetings. So obviously we've all been doing that in our work to a greater or lesser extent since March, but some branches I think have perhaps found the transition to online organising has been a challenge, and it can be a challenge. So there are plenty of sort of activist resources out there for making good use of Zoom. There's all sorts of democracy features that you can get in Zoom, including polls and voting and all that kind of thing. And do seek that out if that's something that your branch is perhaps struggling with a little bit. Right, so the second half of our webinar is going to be looking at the questions that you all submitted in advance of today as part of the registration process. As I said at the beginning, we do have quite a few questions, so we have pulled out the ones that we think you know, need to be addressed sort of most urgently. But if you have additional questions as you're listening, please do submit them and we will try to pick them up if we can. So the first one is one for Alex, I think. And the question is, what best practice are you aware of to ensure that professional services staff remain safe long-term while providing library or other services on site? And the question is sort of a two-parter. It says that the focus has been on measures to create safe buildings when the staff first came back on site, rather than checking that they remain safe. And wanting to ensure that complacency or winter doesn't lead to a fall in standards.
Hi, yes. So, I mean, a risk assessment is a live document, so it shouldn't be produced, stored in a cupboard and never looked at again. You know, it should be continually reviewed to make sure it's effective. So if your risk assessment was in place when you first came on site, then yes, it might have focused on layout and staffing and so on, but that should be continually reviewed. And there should also be monitoring arrangements in place to ensure that any of those control measures remain effective as things change. So some examples of what's changed are there's increasing transmission risks. We've got emerging evidence around the risks of airborne transmission. So workplaces now need to be well ventilated. And, you know, you only have to look at the HSE website to see good practice guidance around, you know, minimum levels of fresh air that should be in the workplace during COVID, which go above and beyond the welfare regulations. And so, you know, these are all significant changes that would require a review of risk assessments and control measures that are in place. Also, once the risk assessment's in place, ways of working, you know, it might have been impractical to implement some of the control measures. So, you know, you have to, rather than do something unsafe, you have to think of a different, safer way of doing things. And so, you know, these are processes that should be agreed with the branch, and you should have, you know, regular engagement with health and safety reps. And hopefully you've got health and safety reps within your libraries as well. And if not, then the branch should look to appoint more health and safety reps, because the larger coverage we've got, the more we can capture these issues and address them locally. So in terms of good practice with libraries, you know, there's lots of research that's been put out there. So the recent government guidance that's gone out does have a link to Libraries Connected, and in particular Library Service Recovery Toolkit, which does have some good suggestions. Now, I would caution that whatever, you know, control measures are within these good practice documents, you need to consider the reality of what's happening on at the ground. What is the you know, the transmission risk, what's the infection rate, or the staff absences, how effective has you know, COVID being controlled in the workplace. So some libraries are operating digital remote services, some doing online order with collection, and some are working outside the box, looking at mobile delivery of materials and setting up mobile units for libraries. And so there's lots of different ways of delivering a library service that reduces risks to staff and students of this increased transmission. And I'm conscious as well that universities are increasingly saying that libraries should be open as a space for students to frequent, because of the mental health challenges facing students and their lack of access to any social spaces. But there are still safe ways of doing that, and there's skeleton staffing, and there is also you know, self-service and things like that. So there's a lot of different control measures that could be considered to make libraries safe. And the risk assessment should really consider the exposure levels of library staff. There's a lot of new evidence coming out around viral load and the cumulative impact of being exposed to multiple people who could be infected with COVID. And so a library is one of those sort of places where there could be a high footfall of people, where viral load definitely needs to be considered. And so I'd also suggest that, you know, you look at any emerging evidence that comes out around libraries, and we get this embedded in risk assessments as control measures. So for instance, I'm aware of new research that's come out to say that COVID-19 is still detectable after 6 days on 4 common library materials when they're stacked. So it might be a case of changing the way you do things to reduce the risk. Lots of libraries have quarantine periods for when books are returned. Given the high infection rate amongst the student body at the moment, it's highly likely that library materials will be returned that, you know, with COVID-19 detectable on them. And so there's just lots of different controls and emerging evidence that you can utilise to make it safer for libraries to either remain open or remain open in a reduced capacity.
Thanks very much, Alex. I know the library's been a focus for some of the health and safety inspections that we've done at Sheffield, precisely for those reasons that you raised, including the footfall sort of issue. Our second question is another one for you, I think. It's what support will be afforded to ARPS staff who decline to work on campus due to COVID safety concerns?
So I mean, as from a national point of view, we've put out these individual letters which branches can issue to individuals who feel at increased risk due to either, you know, inadequacies of their local risk assessment or particular characteristics they have that put them at increased risk of contracting COVID-19 or suffering poorer outcomes as a result. So, you know, there's lots of protections that we could argue should be put in place, alternative duties to allow for increased home working. And, you know, your branch can address these issues both individually and collectively. And we can do that through risk assessments, and we can do through collective agreements. And I think it's just about making people aware of what those issues are and what your rights are under the health and safety legislation, and how you can keep yourself safe. Employers are required to ensure that they provide you with a safe working environment. And so you will not be expected to work in an environment that is not safe. And so, you do need to make people aware of that if that's the case.
Thank you very much. The next question has come from what looks like someone in IT services, but I think is relevant to ARPS members across all sorts of different work areas. And the question says, the workload for IT services staff at my university has become unmanageable for many. Several staff are experiencing mental health related issues as a consequence. Whilst management talk of their commitment to support staff, there's little evidence of this in actuality. There's no prioritisation taking place, and there's an expectation that staff will function above and beyond their usual work rate whilst managing home and family commitments. What does UCU advise to members on how to push back against this position?
Shall I come in on that one? I think Alex will probably talk to you a bit about this is a risk assessment area as well, that actually mental health is an important part of what an employer should be considering. I think on a practical organising level, if there's a specific issue that's affecting a large group of workers, like all the IT staff, then I would be trying to get a meeting of them together as quickly as possible and seeking to escalate those issues as a matter of urgency. It should be something that's considered as part of a risk assessment. And obviously, I know that a lot of IT staff have been coming in and working, maybe doing a lot more lone working or having to deal kind of with a lot more stressed and panicked people, because obviously IT has to function in order that people can work remotely. So it should be something that has been considered, but I think there's an opportunity here for kind of a collective escalation of that problem to get the employer to address it. And they should be doing that as a matter of urgency, because mental health is a really important area for them to be thinking about right now. And that support they provide could be the difference between somebody, ceasing to be able to work or being able to continue. So I think there's a good opportunity there, by the sounds of it, to collectivise that issue and escalate it fairly quickly. And perhaps Alex could talk a little bit about how you might approach that from a kind of health and safety risk assessment way.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, stress is a workplace hazard. It falls under the employer's duty to control stress under the health and safety legislation. So they have to take preventative measures. So in this case, we've already unfortunately got a situation where staff are under extreme pressure due to high workload, and there's a significant impact on their mental health. So if the employer's been made aware of that, then they would certainly be in breach of their duties under the legislation to protect staff from harm. And I think we can take a really hard approach with employers in these sorts of circumstances. I know branches have tried to create, cases, examples from different areas and run surveys to present evidence to employers. And this is a good example of how a generic, institution-wide stress risk assessment could actually tackle the stresses felt by multiple groups of staff, experiencing workload issues. And because you can put in place control measures that ensure that staff are not, being expected to work beyond their hours, and that there'll be no detriment faced to staff who raise these issues. And there'll also be potential, like Jenny was saying, opportunities to negotiate workload controls and other measures that will hopefully reduce the workload on staff, or look to prioritization or to the recruitment of more staff in the short or long term.
That's great. Thank you very much, both. The next question, I think, is almost an extension of the previous one. It says, how can ARPS teams who are required to be on campus, IT, libraries, etc., lobby for more wellbeing support because of the added stress of having to be on site? So I think that's the sort of add-on to what we've just discussed, really, isn't it? Sort of the legal obligation to prevent stress or to minimise stress, and then sometimes what we think of as well-being is on top of that or additional to that. And I'm very aware that universities' well-being support varies wildly between institutions, again, in the same way for staff as it does for students. But Jenny and Alex, do you have anything to add to that? Or I can talk a little bit briefly about some of the work we've done at Sheffield on well-being with human resources, if that would be useful.
Yeah, I think that probably would, Jess. But I mean, to sort of say this is a perfect issue to organise around, and I think lobby is the interesting word in there. I mean, this is the sort of thing you could organise a majority petition on, and I would imagine you'd get a lot of people to support it. They don't have to be members to see that you need to be providing proper support to people. We all know that the juggle is difficult. You know, I've got 2 kids with different start times and different pickup times, and there's all of that I'm trying to juggle whilst doing my job, and I know it's a nightmare for people. And it does add to that feeling of stress because you're always worrying that you're behind the curve. So you're never kind of quite in the right place at the right time. And those things, you know, giving people the ability to control their workload, not putting pressure on them, those kind of things are really important in that setup. And so there are things that can be done to ease that workload pressure on people and to make people understand that it's about doing your best, and sometimes your best, you know, it isn't quite what it was, but that's just the reality of it. So I do think there's an opportunity to organise around this, and I do think it's a sort of thing where you could be putting pressure by collective actions on the employer. But it would be great, Jess, if you could talk about what you've done at Sheffield.
Yeah, so we have spent quite a long time, I mean, long predating COVID, sort of nagging the university about taking stress seriously in terms of the way that they work with the trade unions. For years and years, sort of doing inspections of hotspot departments where we were very aware that you know, a substantial number of staff weren't happy for a certain reason and things like that. And over the last couple of years, we've sort of formalized that into a range of different and improved negotiating fora. So not only the regular negotiating meetings that we have with them formally on health and safety, but we also have a stress risk management working group, which is a very wordy way of saying that the health and safety team, the campus unions, and the HR organisation development and wellbeing people work together on that group. And we've done a range of things as outcomes of that work. That include things like better support for managers in having wellbeing conversations with staff. So, you know, in better resources to structure the sort of training and development that managers have in terms of talking through not just the annual review processes, but just in general having a wellbeing conversation. And it shouldn't be the case that it took a pandemic to sort of bring this to the forefront. But I suppose it's one of those cases where it really brought home, particularly in spring this year, the sort of the cracks in the current systems, and having better support in place in terms of the resources that are available is great. It doesn't really mean anything unless it's backed up with a sort of what Jenny has just said about doing your best, and how that can look very different under very challenging circumstances. And I think if you can get an acknowledgement from the employer that is the case, and what that means in a lot of universities is things like looking seriously at what your promotions criteria are, or your progression frameworks, things like that. We're already very aware that there's hugely gendered impacts of what's happened over this year. You know, for a lot of reasons, women are going to be more heavily impacted in a lot of cases than other people. We also need to consider people who live alone and were very isolated for much of this year. You know, there's all sorts of equalities related ways that employers have to look at this that links in really nicely with the health and safety stuff. And it's absolutely something that branches, I think, should be able to make a really strong case to the employer about. So that's a really good question. So I'm just looking through the rest of the list. I'm going to just, Jenny, if you're looking at the list as well, I'm going to skip to the end, because this is something that's come up quite a few times at Sheffield as well. And I know that you've had a look into this. This is about working from home. And the question says, I expect my electricity bills to be 3 times higher this winter, if not more, as I continue to work from home. This will have a significant effect on my finances due to my pay grade, and I imagine many others are in a similar position. Should our employers be providing financial support for costs associated with our new at-home workplace? So if you can take.
Yeah, no problem. So actually, you can get tax relief for working from home. And in fact, this if you want to go and check this out a bit more, if you go to Martin Lewis's website, moneyexpert.com, he actually talks a bit about how you go about claiming. You can claim via your employer. but your employer doesn't have to facilitate that, but you can claim direct from the government. So it amounts to £6 tax relief a week. You only actually have to work at home for 1 day to be eligible to claim it, but I'm sure most of you have been working at home for a lot longer than that. And you can claim £6 a week tax relief. So it is quite easy process to do, as I understand it. If you're already registered with the government for things like child tax credits, things like that, then you will have an account. It'll be a much simpler process. But it is quite easy, and apparently it's available to anybody who's worked at home, even for as short a period as a day.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. So I'm just looking through the rest of the questions that we've got. There's a question here that I think is quite complicated, but I think it's definitely worth discussing, because I'm aware that this has happened in lots of universities across the sector. It says the university is only offering voluntary redundancy even when jobs are changing dramatically, and which include demotions. Voluntary redundancy impacts on the benefits available. And so what can UCU do to get them to take responsibility and offer compulsory redundancy where there are significant changes to a job? And Jenny, I think that's another one for you, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. So I was actually talking to Alex about this earlier, and there's lots of examples where employers have done this sort of thing. It's not a pandemic-related thing, but needless to say, they're taking the opportunity when they get it. The reality is that the law, it sort of doesn't specify an amount that a job sort of disappears by or changes by, but it says it's substantial. So I guess it's the interpretation that an employment tribunal would put on it, and they would say sort of 50% plus change to a job means it's a substantial change to that job. There's other things that would affect that in individual circumstances. So, for example, the relocation of a job and how that might relate to your personal circumstances as to whether or not you can relocate as well. But I think the kind of key thing to answer this question is, if your job has changed by 50% or more, then it isn't the same job. Now, the problem is that the employer coming in and asserting, oh, it's a voluntary redundancy situation. If you want to apply, you can. If you don't, there's these new jobs. Well, a new job has to be suitable alternative employment, and suitability is determined by grade, pay. It's whether or not it's a sort of work that you've done previously, and we're back into this. Is it 50% more or more of your old job? And is it something you're skilled for, or something that they could provide training that you could bridge that gap so you could skill up for it? And are they prepared to give you the time to do that? It's kind of one of these situations where you just have to hold the line and be really clear that this is a situation where your job has effectively ceased to exist. What I would say is that, generally speaking, a branch where the redundancies happen should be in contact with the regional office, and regional office can give you this kind of support and advice. But you have to kind of be really clear, no, my job has ceased, and therefore this new job you're trying to slot me into is not appropriate. But obviously, you might be able to kind of settle and get an agreement before you kind of have to take it to the wire. And my experience is that most employers will back down when they're challenged on this sort of stuff, but they'll just try and push their luck for as long as possible. And I understand in this specific question, they're talking about VR not being worth as much as compulsory redundancy, which is one of the reasons why the employer is doing it. So it is worth standing your ground, and it is worth fighting on this. And I know, particularly for ARPS staff, there's a real concern about the fact that a lot of roles are being kind of pushed to a lower grade. And this is something grade drift is something that's been talked about quite a lot by academic related professional services staff members. And it is something that the union as a whole is trying to pick up by putting together a model claim, which we're going to sort of launch with branches, hopefully in the next few months, to look at this particular issue, because actually, proper job evaluation should demonstrate where roles sit within an organisation. And if you are doing a job now, for example, that's what we would call a grade 7 role based on the National Framework Agreement, and they're actually lowering it to a grade 6 role, well, actually, has that job been properly job evaluated? Should you be going back and saying, well, hang on a second, who decided this new role is at this grade? This is what I do in this grade, and this fits with this job evaluation process. So there is a need sometimes to really push back on a lot of this stuff, and branches collectively should be doing that, as well as you as an individual.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jenny. I'm conscious that we've only got another sort of 5 minutes left. We've covered the main questions that we'd pulled out of the ones that were submitted in advance. So I'm just reviewing the other ones that we got. We got so many, honestly, it's fantastic. we had quite a few questions around organising ARPS staff that I think were answered effectively by the talks that Jenny and Amy gave at the beginning of the session. So I hope that those of you who submitted those questions, which are along the lines of how have you been effective in organising within your committee, how can we increase professional services UCU members, those ones have been sort of answered already. There's a question here about action short of a strike strategies proposing to our local branches. One of the things that the ARPS committee did produce ahead of the last round of strike action that UCU took nationally was an ARPS specific ASOS set of guidance. I don't know whether the person who submitted this question managed to see that, but we can always review that one again. It's talking about voluntary work. There's also a question there about casualisation, and I think that's a really interesting one because UCU as a whole and higher education as a whole can have a tendency to view casualisation as being a problem that primarily affects researchers, particularly early career researchers, and people who are trying to get into academia. And it's important to remember that we have lots of colleagues on fixed term contracts in other work areas as well. There's been obviously a whole load of national work around casualisation, and you'll be entitled to the same support within your branch as anyone else would be under the law about fixed term contracts. So do contact your branch if you need additional support for a contract that you think should be made permanent. Other than that, have we had any questions while we've been running that anyone's been able to view, or whether our behind the scenes people have picked up any? Because I've not actually been able to see them as we've gone along. If not, I will ask whether Alex or Jenny or Amy. Ooh, we have a question here. Can you reference the 6 days quarantine issue, please? I'm going to pass that one over to Alex, I think, because I'm not sure what the deal is with the 6 days quarantine.
If they're referring to the latest evidence coming out around stacked library materials needing to be having COVID-19 on for 6 days, and yeah, we can link to the research up in the chat on that. That's the only reference I've made to 6 days, so I'm assuming that's the case.
I definitely had 14 days self-isolation in my head. I completely missed it.
Something that does confuse people is contact tracing within workplaces. And so if there is a case of COVID within the workplace, how are they identifying close contacts and from what point? And so the NHS actually says that from the moment the person contracted their symptoms, 48 hours before that is when contacts should be traced. But the World Health Organization, interestingly, says 2 to 3 days. So obviously, we would obviously try and push for as long a period as possible to contact trace, because even with 2 to 3 days, the risk is still there. It's just much reduced. So if we want to avoid transmission, then this is something to consider in the workplace. And that tends to cause a lot of confusion, I think, because of the whole 14 days, 10 days isolation and how it impacts when there is an actual case on site.
I think that's really true, and I think some of the discrepancies that we've seen around the way that different employers have reported this data links to some of those confusions around what the recommendations are for contact tracing as well. I'm certainly aware that some institutions are only reporting as staff cases ones where they were aware they were on campus sort of 48 hours before they became a case. Whereas, if you extend that window, the numbers might be higher. And the whole thing just adds up to a very complicated set of sort of health and legal guidance between them that makes it very, very difficult for individuals to actually navigate, I think, just in general terms. And I think unions and the advice and guidance that they can provide are a really useful source of support in what is a very complex and challenging environment. Are there any other questions before we finish up? If there are any more questions from people who've been watching along, I will take them now. We have 1 more minute, and I always like to go up to the up to the time limit, if not over. but it doesn't look like there are. Do any of our speakers have anything else that they'd like to say before we head off? No? Okay. Well, sorry, Jenny, did you unmute?
I was just going to say actually that it was a really big set of topic areas to try and cover today, and hopefully what we provided people with is a bit of an overview of it all. But we absolutely appreciate that there'll be some staff who we haven't even heard from educational kind of sort of online curriculum development people today, and I'm sure they've been particularly kind of suffering in this, as maybe counselling staff. But I hope, if you've got more questions you want to kind of get in contact with us about, then we're always happy to help wherever we possibly can. And if you think there's stuff that the committee should be specifically doing, then please do get in contact with us. Contact details for me are on the website if you look up for academic related members. My email address appears underneath it, so please do make contact and let us know if there's things that you think the committee should be helping to organise.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jenny. And one of the things we could try to do is pull together answers to all of the questions that we received in advance, maybe, and get those circulated. Okay, well, thank you very much to everyone who has participated today and spoken, Alex, Jenny and Amy. Thank you so much to Rebecca for being our interpreter, and for Martin and Christine for your behind the scenes technical work, which was much appreciated. And yeah, thank you all, everybody, for coming along and participating. And I'll see you all soon. Bye.